All right, hit record on both. All right, so picking up in chapter 24, where we ended last week, David is again in the city of En-Gedi. The reason why he got there, how did David get to En-Gedi? What happened at the end of chapter 23 that helped David out? Yeah, right. We talked about that, right? The Philistines came through and basically saved David because the rumor or the talk of the Philistines invading to get into the western part of Israel, that rumor got back to Saul, and as we talked about the reasons last week, Saul wanted to protect Israel. He had to go and deal with the Philistines. That meant that he had to let David go for the time being. And that allows David to go from that arid region that we just saw to a place where there's a little bit more water. It's a little bit more friendly to live in. And so we begin in chapter 24, and let's read verse 1. And it came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi. All right, so when you're looking at this, when you think about this chapter in its totality, we probably are familiar with this account before, but there are a couple of things that it's important for us to remember as we go in and we read this chapter. All right, so one of the things to keep in mind is how David has been portrayed by Saul. How has Saul labeled David basically to the people of Israel? If we had to put it in modern day terms, Saul's basically put David on Israel's most wanted list because Saul is obviously an enemy of him. But again, think about how David has been portrayed by Saul. Right? Chapter 22, verse 8. When Saul talked to the, I believe that's chapter 22, verse 8. Let me double check real quick. Yes, it is 22, verse 8. Right? He's talking to the men of Benjamin, and he put his son Jonathan in connection with this. But if you note again, 1 Samuel 22, verse 8, Saul says to them that you all have conspired against me. Because in his mind, they have helped David out by not telling Saul where David has run off to. So David has been labeled as a traitor to Israel. He's on the run. Would appear to be the case. We know that it's not, but Saul has branded not just David, but those that are connected to him as traitors. They have conspired against him. That's treason. Not only that, but in 22 verse 8, again, the end of that verse, note what he says again about David, right? Showeth unto me that my son Jonathan has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. And what did we, if you recall, what did we say that to lie in wait meant? Well, we could think about it sort of like the idea of how a lion or a predator stalks his prey. If you've ever watched nature, the Nature Channel or documentaries about it, you ever see a lion hunt, sometimes you'll see the lion sort of sitting in an area where there's tall grass where he's watching his prey. And that's sort of the idea about how David has been portrayed. In other words, that David is basically stalking Saul to figure out the right moment when he can attack and take Saul's life. That's how Saul has depicted David back in chapter 22, verse 8. Well, what happens in chapter 24 is that David's going to refute every single claim that Saul had made about him. Especially this idea that David was stalking Saul to take his life. There comes a later point in David's life where he is actually accused of being responsible for the death of Saul to gain the kingdom for himself. If you've got your Bibles, I want you to look at 2 Samuel chapter 16 and verse 8. 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 8. This is Shimei who is talking to David, and this is all in the context of Absalom's rebellion against David. Note what Shimei says is the reason why Absalom has done this. He says, "The Lord hath returned upon thee, David, all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned, and the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man." You see what Shimei is doing here, and what some apparently were doing later in David's reign, is that they were accusing David of taking Saul's life. It was David that was responsible for the death of Saul, and that David took the throne out of lust for power and lust for the blood of Saul. And that's how some people depicted David. Well, chapter 24 is going to undo all of that. And that's important to keep in mind, because what happens in chapter 24 is that instead of David taking the throne at God's convenience, or taking the throne at his convenience, he doesn't do that. Even though he's been promised the throne by God, what happens is David's going to wait on God for the right opportunity to allow God to give him the throne, rather than to take the law into his hands and take it for himself. So in other words, as we talked about last week, whereas the providence of God saved David in that particular setting, so David's going to continue to rely on the providence of God to give him the kingdom. He's not going to take matters into his own hands. And thus, he's not going to be this person that is, as Saul has said, that is out to get him. He's not this person who is a traitor, but he's doing everything and he's keeping his actions in line with God and relying on his providence. And this chapter is a defense of David. And so that helps us to think about this as we go forward, because David's going to get a chance to, as the imagery is, David's going to have a chance to jump out of the grass and attack and kill his prey in this chapter. So again, verse 1, right? David has fled from the wilderness of Maon. He has arrived at the wilderness or the area of En-Gedi. Again, it's referred to as the Fountain of the Goats, as we saw a minute ago. This is an oasis in an arid region. You've got caves here, as is noted in verse 2. So there are natural reasons why David would have fled to this area. Now again, note that Saul has been told of David's location once again. We've talked about in earlier chapters how David is winning over a lot of the Israelites. He hasn't won over all of them. And whoever is telling Saul of David's location, David has obviously not won over, because Saul is still getting word about where David is located. And so if you put yourself in David's shoes, obviously you're on the run, but you have this reoccurring thing over and over again where Saul seems to know where you're located, or he's able to find you. And that's certainly not a good feeling. I'm sure none of us in here have ever felt that you've been on the run, but if you think about as a kid, sometimes you got in trouble, and sometimes you thought that maybe to get out of trouble you could hide from your parents, right? And you could escape getting a spanking or getting whatever type of punishment. But your parents always found you, right? Or your parents always found out what you did. And maybe in a way it sort of feels like that for David, right? David's on the run, but Saul keeps figuring out somehow he knows where David is at. And it certainly would not be a comforting feeling. Now we note in verse 2 a similar point that we have seen before, right? Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. Right? And we've seen this before because we've talked about, right? If God is on the side of Saul, he doesn't necessarily have to have so many men to go take out David and his men. In fact, if we do the math here, Saul actually takes with him about 5 times more men than what David had. Last count that we had, David had 600 men with him, but Saul is taking 3,000 with him to go attack David and his men. And if Saul trusted in God and knew that God was on his side, numbers would not have mattered to Saul, but yet, we see Saul taking so many men with him to try to attack David. You note also in verse 2, again, that the phrase here, again, chosen men. The word there, chosen men, would indicate to us that these are actually special soldiers within Saul's army. In Judges chapter 20, verses 15 and 16, you read about the men that formed the armies of the tribe of Benjamin, and you read about 700 chosen men that were selected out of that army because they were accurate with their slingshot. But they were called chosen men. They were sort of like the elite troops. We could think about this today. Saul's not calling in the army, he's calling in the Marines or the Navy SEALs or, whatever specialist military unit you can think of. That's who he's calling in to go and to try to seek out David, to take his life, obviously. And so, we get that picture of how many men Saul are using. And then the end of verse 2, again, he calls this place the rocks of the wild goats. That's actually the meaning of the word En Gedi. So those are kind of interchangeable there. So verse 3, Saul arrives at En Gedi. And where he arrives at is not very fortunate for him. Verse 3, and he came to the sheepcotes by the way where there was a cave. And Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. Now the King James Version uses the word sheepcotes. If you're looking at another version, what do you have there? Sheepfolds. I was pulling up really quick what the ESV had on that, because I did not write that down. What was that? Sheep pens. So what we're told that this or what this indicates is to us is, we saw those pictures a minute ago of, the cliffs and everything like that. And we pointed out how there were often caves, right? As obviously as the story indicates here. We're told that sometimes shepherds would use caves to protect their flock. If a storm came, you had really bad weather, you don't want to leave your sheep out in the elements. So sometimes if they were grazing in that part of the area, they would take them and actually put them in a cave to protect them. And so sometimes caves were referred to in this way because that's what their function was. And that's what again what is being described here, as evidenced by the following section there, verse 3, where there was a cave. And so if we're familiar with this story, we understand, again, Saul went in to cover his feet. We might could just say that Saul went in to take care of his business. But you note, of course, that this is the same cave where David and his men were residing. They were either, some would say that it depends on how there are several translations about how the picture is here. It could have been that David and them are actually farther inside the cave. So this evidently had to be a very big cave. Perhaps that David and his men are further deep inside the cave, and Saul only enters into the entrance. But there are others that say that perhaps what happens is that David and his men are sort of around that cave. They're situated around that cave, but they're in hiding. But the point being, and the point that we take away from this, is that Saul is by himself where he's separated from his men, whereas David and his men somehow get note of how Saul is separated from his men, and maybe perhaps they see it. I'm sure they do see it, but whatever the case, that's the important part. All right, Saul is separated from his men. David and his men now have the perfect opportunity to take Saul's life. So that by verse 4, David's men are going to point that out to him. Now, one thing that I'll mention about at the end of verse 3, you think about the leader of a country, it's often hard for the leader to get privacy, right? If you think about the president, there's somebody that keeps up with what the president does, right? That lays out the schedule for him. He's got, secret security. When you are no longer president, right? You are assigned a team of secret security agents, right? And so you don't have the privacy that a normal person does. Well, any type of leader, that's obviously the case, but obviously one instance in which the person got privacy was obviously based on what Saul was doing. And I point that out because I've tied in here, or I put in my Bibles, Judges chapter 3, verses 24 through 25. Because in that passage we read about the story of Ehud and the king of Eglon. And if you remember, Ehud went in to talk to the king of Moab in private. But the guards were stationed basically outside to listen to what was going on. Well, Ehud left, and the king of Eglon didn't respond for a while, and his men thought that what Saul's doing here is what the king of Eglon was doing, and they didn't want to enter in because they didn't want to interrupt his privacy. And so, sort of a similar situation there, but again, the picture is this is the prime opportune moment for David to finally get at Saul, where he could get away and not have to worry about Saul's men getting to him, because Saul is completely separated from his men. He's completely in private. So now, verse 4, we see the response of what David's men want him to do with Saul. Verse 4, the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privately. So the advice of David's men, simply verse 4, this is the right moment from God. Again, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand. His men are saying, you've been trusting in the providence of God. Well, here's the providence of God at work. You've got the opportunity to take Saul's life. He has been your enemy. He has done it. He has been your enemy unjustly. Right? As we've noted before, when people asked Saul, "What did David do to you?" Saul could not provide an answer that justified killing David. And so David's men say this is the prime opportunity. This is the moment where God has provided for you to kill Saul. Now you note here that they're referring here to a promise or a prophecy that God gave, or a guarantee that God gave to David. Now we don't see anywhere in 1 Samuel where it specifically says, where we specifically see God promise that he would deliver Saul into David's hand. We don't see that anywhere in particular, but 1 Samuel 23 verse 4, we do read about God telling David through the prophet Gad that God would deliver the Philistines into David's hand. But this is not Saul. So, not exactly sure if this actually happened or if the men are just making this up. But their point is that this is the prime opportunity to take care of Saul. Now, we've thought about this from the perspective of David, right? But again, think about the perspective of David's men. It's not just David who's under attack here, right? It's not just David who would be put to death, right? David's men that are with him, if they're caught with David, they're going to face the exact same punishment as him. They're going to be put to death as traitors as well. They very likely could have families as well. They've been on the run for a while. It might be that they left home to follow after David. And there would be a natural reason to want to go back home. If you take care of Saul, you end the problem. We can return to life like normal, basically is a way that we could think about it. And so, they have great reason to try to tell David, this is the prime time to take Saul's life. In fact, I want to point this out too. Based on the law of Moses, David very well could have a case for taking Saul's life. If you would turn in your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 19. Deuteronomy chapter 19, beginning in verse 16. What I mean to say is that if we pay attention to what is mentioned here, it wouldn't be all that far-fetched to think that maybe David could be in the right to take David's life, or to take Saul's life here. All right, so Deuteronomy 19, beginning in verse 16, you're talking about what happens if a person, a malicious witness, bears false witness against a person, and that accusation turns out to not be true. All right, so the question then becomes, what do you do to the person that made the false accusation? All right, so again, let's read Deuteronomy 19, verses 16 through 19. If a malicious witness arises, and I'm reading this out of the English Standard, the ESV. If a malicious witness arises to accuse a person of wrongdoing, then both parties to the dispute shall appear before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who are in office in those days. The judges shall inquire diligently, and if the witness is a false witness and has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him as he had meant to do to his brother, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. What you note there, what is the punishment done to the one who bore false witness? Well, whatever punishment he desired for the one he made a false accusation against, that punishment could come back on him. Saul, as we've seen, has made a lot of false accusations about David, right? Based on what is said here, if they were to, of course, you have the process of appearing before the judges, going to court, but Saul, bearing false witness, trying to kill David, wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility for Saul to be put to death if you apply what the law of Moses said about that. And so you think about that to say that, not only is this an opportune moment, but you could almost look at the law of Moses and say, you have the right to do this, David. And so, verse 4, the end of it, David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe. Now, the cutting off of the robe. We're told that in the culture in that area, this was often a way to show ownership of something. If you were to go in to cut off a piece of a robe of somebody else, it could be a way to show ownership or to show dominance over another individual. And as we're going to see later on, David has a change of heart, but possibly the intent there, verse 4, is that cutting off of the robe of Saul was a way to show Saul that, I had your life in my hands. Right? If Saul's life was within David's hands, David had control in that situation, right? And the king, who we've seen over and over again, is obsessed with maintaining his control, that would not have sat very well with Saul. But generally, whenever you read about the cutting of the robe, there are times when it generally would show, when it meant something either evil or it showed malicious intent. If you recall back in 1 Samuel chapter 15, when Saul was told that the kingdom would be taken away from him, what happened with him and Samuel in that discussion? Do you remember what happened?
He grabbed hold of Samuel's robe and it tore.
Right. Saul went to plead with Samuel. Saul went to plead with Samuel. Saul grabs a part of Samuel's robe, and you remember that it tore. Do you remember what Samuel said in response to that?
Kingdom's torn from you.
Yeah, the kingdom is torn from you. So the tearing of the robe in that situation is a little bit different, but it showed something that was, it would be something that was evil for Saul. Likewise, what happens here, and we get that from verse 5, David had the wrong intent with what he's doing here. And so let's just read verse 5, right? David has a change of heart. And it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. What's another way that we could say that David's heart smote him? Yeah, his conscience bothered him, right? We could say he repented in his own mind, right? He had a change of heart. And that's where we get the indication that in verse 4, David had malicious intent for what he was going to do to Saul. right? That he was going to cut off the part of the robe of Saul. So that, verse 5, David thinks about it, and his heart bothered him. His conscience bothered him. And as the reasons that we've noted before shows malicious intent, sometimes an act like this was a sign of disloyalty to a king. At least what we're told, that sometimes an action like this, whether that was the cutting off of the leader's clothes or taking something from the leader, it was a sign of disloyalty. And this is why it's important to think about how Saul has betrayed David, right? Because if David is doing an action here that shows his disloyalty to Saul, then everything Saul has said about David beforehand, all those accusations that have been made, it turns out they look like they were true, because David has just done something to Saul that was generally seen as a sign of disloyalty. And yet, if you think about it in that sense, David had great reason to repent, or great reason to regret what he had done. And that's what happened, right? David, as we'll see, verse 6, David did not want to be thought of as a man that was unloyal to the king, because David understood those accusations being made against him. He didn't want them to be right. I've got in my Bible here 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12, because I think, this verse really is a verse that applies here. About dealing, again, this is a verse about dealing with people who have done you wrong. And it gives us something to think about as well. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 12. Peter tells the readers there, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, that whereas they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Peter was pointing out, in a way, that the Christians in his day were not all that different from David. A lot of times, I think we've mentioned this before, but a lot of times Christians were persecuted. You see that throughout the New Testament. A lot of times they were persecuted unjustly, right? And you see that throughout the book of Acts. You had rumors that were spoken about them, but yet here's what Peter says. Keep things honest, keep things honorable in the sight of all men, because all those accusations that they falsely put on you, they will never be proven to be true if they were tried in a court of law, because your actions are honorable. And it's going to work it will work to your benefit, is what Peter's saying there by the end of verse 12, that they may, by your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. And part of that meaning that you can prove your own innocence. And I put that in there because, and I've tied that into 1 Samuel 24 and verse 5, because David is a man who is a man after God's own heart. He'd want his conduct to be honorable, not just among Gentiles, but especially among his own people. And yet, like as Christians in the first century, David had people that were speaking ill will of him. And David could have very well let those accusations become true if he gave into his anger, or if he gave into this desire to seek out revenge on Saul. He would have proven Saul to be true. But David understood that, right? Even if David is suffering unfairly, what he's going to do is, we see moving forward, he's going to put this matter in God's hands and let him be the judge of the matter. And so the point being for us as Christians is, it ties in with David, well, with what David's going through here. Comes some point in our life where somebody, maybe they don't make a false accusation against us, but they say something about us that's untrue. And it can be very easy for us to try to get revenge. It can be very easy for us to go around and to say something evil or mean behind their back. And maybe it makes us feel good in the temporary moment, just like killing Saul would probably have made David feel somewhat good in the temporary moment. But, it doesn't benefit you in the long run. And David understands that. We as Christians have to understand that. Sometimes we have to let God handle the matter of justice, and we can't always seek to get even when somebody does us wrong. And David recognizes that. That's why he has a change of heart. Let's go ahead and read verse 6. before we go tonight. And he said unto his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. Now that verse is a good stopping point because it ties in with the thing that we said at the very beginning. Right? David's not power hungry. He doesn't want to lust. He's not lusting after the blood of Saul. He doesn't want to, he doesn't want to relish in taking his life. He's got the very opportunity to do that, but he recognizes what his place still is. Even though that God has given up on Saul and has told David he's going to be the next king, Saul is still at this moment the king of Israel, and David still respects that, and he's going to do right by that. And this is one final thought that we'll make about that, and then we'll note one point of application connected with that. You note again the contrast between Saul and David. David was sorrowful because he cut off the skirt of Saul's robe. Whereas a robe is pretty expensive, it's just a piece of clothing, right? It's just a piece of clothing. David felt regret over that, but how many times do we see Saul feel regret for the number of men that he killed, the number of men that he tried to have killed in order to get at David? We see some occasions, but very little do we see about Saul expressing regret for his actions. And what he's done is, in a lot of ways, a lot worse than what David has. And so, when you're thinking about, why David would be the next king, you see that great contrast between David and Saul. David was not a man that was willing to kill his own people to get his way. And that speaks very well about David. And the point of application is simply this, just as David trusted in God to providentially save him with matters in which that were out of his control, David didn't. David is ultimately going to take the point in this situation that he's going to let God handle bringing Saul to justice. And sometimes we try our best to do everything that's right, and we try our best to correct problems and handle situations when we maybe have to deal with people that are unfair to us. But sometimes we're not able to completely resolve those in this life. And we have to focus on doing what we can, living by what the Bible says, doing and living as Christ would have us do. And the things that we can't solve that are out of our control, we have to let God handle that one day. As Brother Wayne talks about in the book of Romans class, God said, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." And we allowed God to handle those type of matters. Well, that being said, are there any comments that you'd like to add on before we close tonight? Brother Neil.
In the verse 6 where David said that the Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, I have read somewhere, I can't tell you when or where, that in order to, if a person took a hold of the king's robe or crown or anything, it was the same as he was taking a hold of the king.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're doing damage to his crown or his robe or anything, you would be doing damage to the king also, could be considered that. And so that's one reason why David was so sorrowful about cutting him off. I think, that may have applied there, that he took advantage of the king.
Oh yeah. No, that makes complete sense, right? Just one example, I think about baseball. If you ever watch baseball, you know that batters do not like getting hit with a pitch, especially with a fastball. And sometimes they may not get hit, but their clothes get nicked. But if you hit a guy, if you hit the hem of his pants, you may not actually hit him to hurt him. But sometimes batters take that personally as though you were trying to hurt them, even though you just hit the clothing. But it's the same point. You attack, the clothes that are on me, that's the same idea as you attacking myself. And that's a good point that you brought up, Brother Neil. Well, that being said, we're going to go ahead and stop here tonight. But again, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. We'll pick up in verse 7 next week.